Hello and welcome to the Knowledge Live Q&As. I'm Tom from the communications team. Thank you for joining me today. We thought that whilst we're all in quarantine and in lockdown, that because we have a wide variety of knowledge and expertise at Keele, we get some of our academics live on Facebook for a Q&A. The last few have been on COVID-19 and this one is no different, but from a really fascinating point of view. And today I'm joined by Professor Clifford Stott. Hello, Clifford.
Hi, Tom.
So, Clifford, do you want to sort of introduce your area of expertise and what it is that you do at Keele?
I'm a social psychologist, or more specifically a crowd psychologist by background, but I focus on the issue of policing, the dynamics of police-citizen encounters, and I have a lot of expertise around riots and disorder. So that's my theoretical focus, and I do a lot of work advising governments and police forces on policing, and I'm currently sitting on a subcommittee of SAGE, the advisory group for government at the moment, advising on policing and security issues.
Fantastic. So as we go through the stream, if you've got any questions that you want me to ask Clifford, please do comment them down below and I'll try and ask them as we go along. But firstly, it is a massive task. It must be a huge task policing a lockdown. Just from your point of view, how do you think that the most strict period that has just passed, how do you think that went? Did it go well from a policing standpoint?
Yeah, I think it did. I think anyone's only got to take a cursory glance at the difference between different countries. If we say, for example, compare ourselves with Italy or France, in those countries, the enforcement of the lockdown has been a lot more draconian, and police enforcement a lot harsher. Millions of stop and search, hundreds of thousands of fines in France. And interestingly, in France, there have already been episodes of quite serious rioting in Paris that's associated with these more harsher forms of policing and lockdown measures. So I think in the UK we've seen none of that. We've seen very relatively few enforcement notices issued by the police. We've seen a strong commitment by the police nationally to an agenda that's around what they call the 4 E's. So that's engage, explain, encourage, and only if those don't work, enforce. Now, of course, there's been some variability, and I'm sure many of the people listening today will recall Derbyshire Police, for example, with drones and dying lakes and so on, and other examples of confusion really about how the lockdown needed to be policed. But in general terms, I think we've seen a very successful period of policing the lockdown. And I think a lot of that is really about the active way in which people have embraced the lockdown. In a sense, we've not really needed for the lockdown to be policed because people and communities have been policing themselves in the lockdown. So I think that's another thing that needs to be taken into account here, that when we talk about policing, what we mean is enforcement by the police. But actually, policing is something far wider than that is also about how communities self-regulate and adhere to government guidance. And I think that strong level of adherence has been a key factor in why the police enforcement side of the issue has been very successful, because it's not been necessary to enforce.
And so with the measures now slightly easing, does this pose any new challenges for policing?
Yeah, lots of challenges. I think first and foremost that as we move into what we might call a liberalisation of lockdown in the UK, police enforcement to an extent becomes impossible. I mean, let's just look at what's changed. So prior to the liberalisation, the message was stay at home. The guidance was very clear that you're allowed out once, and you're allowed out for exercise. The new guidance says, well, you can go out as many times as you want, and you can go out for a variety of reasons, including relaxation and emotional well-being. Now, given that guidance is there and the changes in the law that have accompanied that shift, really means that you can go out whenever you want. People can go out of the house whenever they want, as many times as they want, and stay out of the house for extended periods of time. So it becomes impossible for the police to really enforce people outside in terms of, well, you can't go up to somebody and say, well, you need to go home, because quite clearly the guidance is that you don't need to be at home. What it also does is it's shifting the agenda slightly towards more obvious violations of the legislation and the guidance. And that, of course, relates to what we might call public assembly or any large gatherings. So what effectively remains illegal in this context is people to gather together in groups. And that, I think, is a big shift, because what it means is that the police enforcement agenda is going to start to become focused on those gatherings, and therefore becomes something that's slightly more problematic to deal with, and would normally be something that we would talk about in terms of public order policing or crowd control. And those dynamics are really quite complex, and ones that could lead us into difficulties, particularly when the lockdown liberalisation steps up another gear and the government guidance begins to allow us to gather together in smaller groups, that households can mix. So then the only thing that really becomes illegal under the emergency guidance is emergency legislation are things like house parties, street parties, religious gatherings, and so on. And that has a different dynamic and opens up a whole series of challenges as we move through the summer.
And so how do you think that police can maintain a good relationship with the public whilst also enforcing those social distancing measures?
Well, we've done a lot of work on precisely that question, really. And I think that however you look at it, it brings us really back to some of the fundamentals around which British policing, UK policing is built, and built historically. And that's really something that revolves around the idea of policing through consent or with the consent of the public. And it's captured really neatly in a rather cliched statement attributed to Robert Peel, who back in the 19th century, essentially as a Home Secretary, created policing, civilian policing. And the idea is of the public, for the public, by the public. And what that captures is the importance of policing from within the community. Policing of a style that people who are listening who are of my age will recall, a TV series called Dixon and Doc Green. And it portrayed the notion, the idea of British policing as this Bobby, the British Bobby, the non-coercive, not kind of riot-controlled, paramilitarised style of policing, but the Bobby walking the beat, connected and as part of the community. And I think that successful policing in this context is very much about going in the direction back to that idea of neighbourhood policing, where police are embedded within the community on a regular basis. They're getting to know people in that community. They're getting to understand the difficulties that those communities are experiencing as a function of the lockdown. They're working with communities to address those difficulties in ways that empowers the community to deal with the crisis and to address the problems that it is experiencing, so that this creates an environment where the police are far more in line with community values and norms and understandings. They have better relationships. So if incidents do develop, they're better connected to people in those communities to help de-escalate and to deal with any emergent problems. So really the answer, I suppose, is policing from within.
And now I think you mentioned it earlier, we did see a few small gatherings over the weekend, protests around in the UK about the lockdown, but we seem to have seen so much more in America. Why do you think that is? Is it a difference in cultures, or do you think it's a difference in policing styles?
Yeah, it's. I mean, there were lots of differences. We just writing a paper at the moment on this issue. I mean, I think we need to be careful here about gross oversimplification in a sense. As if one country is one way and one country is another. I mean, yes, there have been protests in America, but we also have a particular political system in America. We have a particular sort of political ideology at work in America. This sort of underpinning populism and libertarianism that hasn't really taken off in this country in the same way. It's a different sort of political system in this country. And what we need to recognise here is that under the situation of COVID and COVID-19, the issue really is about spread. It's about what can we do to limit the spread of this virus. And of course, public gatherings are dangerous in that regard, because when people come together in physical proximity, they obviously increase the likelihood that they can become vectors of the virus. And that's why we need to limit it. But let's be clear about what we're limiting. And limiting the ability of people to protest is a very, very big thing to do. To prevent people expressing their political discontent is a fundamental change in the structure of democracy. So the protest issue is one that we need to tread quite carefully around and understand in a balanced way what the dangers are. So let's reflect back on this weekend in the UK. You will recall that there was quite a lot of news before the weekend of this so-called plan to have mass gatherings in parks all over the UK. And there was quite a lot of concern about that, both in the media and indeed in policing circles. But what we saw on the ground was practically no mobilisation at all. The only significant public assembly to protest took place in Hyde Park. And then it was really only just a handful of people who came together in order to express their discontent. It didn't really take off as a protest movement, and has remained relatively isolated and small scale. But the public concern was really quite salient. However, at the same time, over the weekend, there was at least one free party, a rave, that had much more people at it. And actually, in terms of the vectoring of the virus, was far more of an issue than our concern about protest. But in a sense, we kind of ignore that as if it's not important, when indeed it is. So I think that's partly what we need to start to do here, is to think differently about what the problems are and how we deal with them, and recognise that when we try to deal with them, that we've got to interact with those problems in ways that help us not to create problems that are going to be a little bit worse, that start to erode our freedoms or create social tensions. So, for example, one of the issues that has already been run into in certain areas in the country are communities within which they've got pubs who have been having lock-ins. So people from those communities have been going to pubs, and they've been with the landlord conspiring and locking themselves into the pub. So the pub's effectively open but closed. Now, where the police have got wind of that, they've gone in and forced those pubs to close. Whereas at the same time, in a neighbouring community that's got a high Muslim population, those communities have been attending funerals with large public gatherings around them. So the police there haven't been intervening in the same way. And that's runs the danger then of feeding into a new dynamic, and a new dynamic through which those who seek to exploit racial tensions start to come into the mix and start saying, well, hang on a minute, well, they're policing us, but they're not policing them. And what we start to see is an emerging problem because of our attempts to try to close down the issue of public assembly. Now, these things are important because they can have longer term consequences. And those longer term consequences are going to become really important to us as a society as we start to experience the longer term effects of the lockdown measures. Because the focus, of course, in the lockdown is very much about controlling the virus. But we're all beginning to become aware now that actually the lockdown is causing severe economic harm. So I think just yesterday on the news, there was the announcement that one of the big restaurant chains, I think that they run restaurant chains like Bella Italia, has gone into administration. And there's 6,000 jobs that are being lost there. Now that kind of thing is going to be happening all over the place. Unemployment is going to start to go up. The economic damage of lockdown is going to feed into structural conditions for people that are really quite bad. Unemployment, can't access work. And I think as well, let's bear in mind that there are particular sections of the community that are much harder hit by all of this, and in particular, young people. So young people's employment prospects, young people's opportunities are disproportionately more affected than people, say, for example, like myself. I'm an academic, I've carried on with salaried employment, I'm able to work from home. Economically, at the moment, the lockdown measures are not hitting me as much as they are my daughter, who's 19, who stands very little chance of finding meaningful employment at the moment. And that's probably going to get even harder because access to employment opportunities are going to be diminished as a function of the economic decline. Now, when you roll that all out into the future, that raises some really quite serious issues about what our society is going to be like and the social tensions within it, the protests that might grow up, how those protests are policed, how the communities are policed, will be central to how those dynamics play themselves out over the longer term.
Yeah, so a very delicate issue then. Is there some sort of psychological explanation behind whether when a few people start to do something, so when a few people start to push the boundaries of the lockdown and start to do things like attend lock-ins at pubs and do those prohibited things, that more then follow? Is there a psychological explanation behind that?
Well, yeah, of course, there is at some level. I mean, people want to gather together. I mean, you don't want to be isolated from people around you. Of course, people want to be together. And it's a problem for all of us that we can't gather to do the things that we would normally do. And the reason that we're not doing that is to some extent because we recognise a collective responsibility that if we behave in different ways and we follow government guidance about social distancing and so on, then we can make quite a big contribution to diminishing the impact of the virus on the community as a whole. So the question then becomes, well, why do some people not want to adhere to that? Why do some people not want to follow government guidance? Well, to a large extent, a lot of that is about the capacity to adhere to government guidance. So, as we see with the liberalisation of the lockdown, one of the main things that is being said here is that basically you can go back to work. Well, a lot of people, when they go back to work, are going to need to travel on public transport to do that. Now, if you can't go on public transport without coming into close proximity with people, you don't really have any choice about that. So, in effect, the whole issue of coming together and violating social distance isn't just about motivation. It's about the circumstances, the situation in which people behave. And sometimes you just basically can't avoid it. So when you go to the supermarket, for example, part of our capacity to retain social distancing in the supermarket is because the supermarket management have structured the environment to try to maximise our ability to do that. Well, if employers, if transport companies, if those who own the public spaces don't structure those spaces in ways that allow us to distance, then it's impossible for us to do it when we go in there. So that's a key thing that needs to be addressed here. So it's a bit distorting to try to attribute all of the issues to human psychology and motivation, as if those that adhere to distancing have somehow got some kind of moral or psychological issue that means that they don't adhere. Let's be clear. It's a lot easier for people who live in big houses and work from home to stay distant than it is people who live in flats in close proximity to one another with no gardens, no access to the internet, and no access to stable employment. Right? There's a structural class issue at work here. And we know that that's having a deleterious effect. So you're far more likely to die from COVID if you're poor. You're far more likely to die from COVID if you come from a black and ethnic minority population. Now, it's partly because race and ethnicity are intersectional. You're more likely to be poor if you're from an ethnic minority, etc. So there's a whole lot of issues here that's got nothing to do with psychology and everything to do with how we structure the environment and how we maintain environments in ways that are safe for people to go into. And that is by far and away the most important issue. But for some reason, we don't talk about that as much. We sort of say, oh, well, you know, are you conforming? Are you adhering? As if that's the primary issue. Well, it's not. Now, having said that, of course, then people do, openly violate government guidance. But when we look at the data about who that is, in the main, it is young men in particular. Now, in part, I would suggest that that's partly because a lot of young men see themselves as not really at risk, and therefore they feel less inclined towards having to control social distancing, because they don't feel as though if they violate social distancing, they're actually going to suffer too much from that. So that's by far and away sort of one of the key features of the data that we've got at the moment. But then when we roll that out, then the issue is, well, okay, so what is it that we're trying to control here? How do we balance that against a wider set of issues? We are now policing an environment where being outside is more acceptable. And at the end of the day, if you've got a group gathered together in the public space, well, quite frankly, they're already gathered together, aren't they? And if they've done that already, then they've already come into contact with one another. So at what point do we go in to break that up? And does breaking it up actually then cause more of a problem? Because if you disperse all of these people all over the place and they're vectoring the virus, then they're more likely to come into contact with other people. Whereas if they stay together in that location, that's not going to happen. So again, there's a complex set of issues here that need to be addressed that aren't just about psychology. They're about understanding the nature of the broader context within which human behaviour is taking place, and trying to manage and police that in ways that are least likely to cause subsequent increases in the overall vectoring of the disease, and therefore reduce the extent to which the disease is going to kill people.
And so do you think that we were behind Italy in our lockdown, and other countries were before us? Have we learned anything in terms of how we've applied our policing from what we learned from other countries?
God, I mean, there's some powerful questions in an issue like that. I mean, of course we need to learn from other countries. Let's look at some of the more successful countries. Let's look at places like New Zealand. Let's look at the death rates in countries like that. They're absolutely minuscule in relationship to what's happened in the UK. We've got one of the highest death rates in the world. And that is, I don't know how anybody can look at that and not say that is a massive issue, and that we've got a lot to learn from other countries. But what is it that we're learning here? And this is a long game, not a short one. This virus is going to be around for a long, long time. And controlling it is a challenge at many different levels, but not least of all, as we've already discussed, in terms of our capacity to retain normal economic functioning to a level that's good for the UK economy and good for UK society and so on and so forth. Well, when we look at the more effective countries like New Zealand, they're already going back into a much more relaxed and liberal position. Now, that's been possible in part because they were able to close their borders. It's in part because they were much better prepared in terms of PPE and in terms of the hospital infrastructure. They were much more prepared in terms of having tracking and testing. If you look at places like South Korea, for example, really successful way in which it's been managed. But that is all about preparation. It's all about a particular strategy around track and trace and surveillance software that allows people to know if they've been into contact with other people who have then subsequently become infected. And they've been able to know that they've become infected because they've been able to access a test. We're still a long way away from that in terms of our ability to then sort of move into a liberalised environment where we can still retain some control over the vectoring and identification of the disease, and we're a long way from that. Whereas other countries are already in that phase, and it's quite likely that what will happen in those more effective countries like New Zealand is that they will have significantly, and I mean really significantly, lower levels of death, but also that they will suffer less economic harm as a function of adopting those approaches. And we, quite frankly, are miles behind with that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So one final question before we finish. You're also your research covers crowds and in particular sporting events. Do you have any idea what sporting events may look like? And do you think it's possible to have a football match with social distancing measures on the crowd?
I think, moving forward, we've got a really challenging set of issues evolving over football at the moment. Can we finish the season this year? Can the 2019-2020 season be finished? Now, I think it's a really good microcosm of what the problem is, across the whole world. Really, is that in part the reason that the football authorities are so keen to reinstate football is, of course, an economic argument. That if they don't finish the season, then they're basically going to have to pay the TV companies back millions of pounds. And there's an economic harm that's going to be caused by that reality. But we move into a situation where they're trying to reinstate it for other reasons. That other reasons are also important here in terms of sort of bringing some level of normality and helping us to begin to move back to a level of normality where we can start to adapt to life with the virus, which we're all going to have to learn how to do. And a key part of that is stopping mass gatherings. So one of the debates at the moment is whether or not football, if it does come back this season, plays behind closed doors, either in the venues of the clubs themselves or has to play in neutral venues somewhere else. And that debate's quite a contentious debate about whether or not fans are going to try to gather outside grounds. And that they should be at neutral venues because they're further away, and therefore fans will be less likely to get to travel and gather outside. Now, I think that's a wrong argument to be applied here. I don't think fans will travel. I don't think fans need to be seen as somehow an inherent problem that needs to be managed from a public order perspective. And in any case, it's not actually illegal to go outside. It's not illegal to stand outside of a stadium. If you want to, if you need that for emotional well-being and leisure, it's perfectly legal to do it. The issue here is mass gatherings, and the dangers here aren't about people gathering outside. They're about people gathering inside. So when these football matches come on, what's the likelihood that people are going to gather together in you've got a mate, you're going to go around to your mate's house and you get the beers in and you're going to watch the football. That's the real danger. So again, it's about perspective here. And what we're policing here is not public order, but an epidemic. And we need to think of it in terms of an epidemic and manage the epidemiological issues in as effective a way as we can as we come back into some form of functional normality. And I would take the view that we have to learn how to do that, because if we don't, we're going to be living in a society that has an extreme economic crisis of an unprecedented level. I mean, for me, one of the shocking figures to that extent was recently France announced that it had gone into recession on a scale that had not been experienced since 1945. But just reflect on that. What does that mean? That the only thing that's worse for your economy is to be raging total war in your country. That's the reality that we're looking at in terms of what's happening here to economic functioning. So we have to, at some level, start to think, well, how do we get back to a capacity to start to think about managing our way of life that allows us to go back to university, to go back to sporting life, to go back to working life in ways that manage that risk to retain some level of control over the spread of this hideous virus.
Clifford, absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for answering all our questions there. We'll leave it there. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to all those who watched. Clifford, thank you very much. I hope you're staying safe and enjoying lockdown as much as possible, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.